David anxiously paced back and forth in the living room, clutching his phone tightly, his thumb hovering over the screen as he waited for the call to connect. "Hi honey, how's the conference going?" he asked softly, when the call finally went through, though there was a hint of unease in his tone. His eyes wandered over the familiar family photos that adorned the walls, wedding pictures, vacations and cherished moments they had once shared. In the background he could faintly hear muffled noises, likely from the crowd near Emily. "Everything's fine, I just wrapped up a session." "I'll call you later," she replied curtly, sounding eager to end the conversation. David halted his pacing, and the silence between them grew heavier with each second. "Okay," he said hesitantly, sensing something off in her voice, as though she was distracted. "Love you," he added. But the words came out with uncertainty. "Love you too," she responded, though her words felt empty, lacking the warmth he so desperately missed. After the call ended, David stared at his phone for several moments, his brow furrowed in thought. Something was bothering him. But he couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. With a heavy sigh, he sank into the couch, tossing his phone aside and massaging his temples in frustration. Emily had been distant for 3 months now. And David kept trying to convince himself it was just a temporary phase. Her new job demanded constant travel and long hours, which had strained their relationship, but David reassured himself it wouldn't last forever. His childhood friend, Oscar, often told him the same thing: she's just adjusting to the new role. "It's tough at first, but things will get easier," Oscar would say in his usual calm, confident voice. And David believed him. Why wouldn't he? Oscar had been his best friend since they were kids, and Emily was his wife, the woman he had vowed to spend his life with. There was no reason to doubt her, right? David's thoughts drifted back to the early days of their relationship. He remembered how Emily used to send him sweet messages throughout the day, just to let him know she was thinking of him. They would stay up late talking, plan impromptu dates, and laugh together over the silliest things. Those memories felt distant now, but he clung to them, hoping this was just a rough patch. "We're just going through a tough time," he muttered, trying to soothe the growing unease in his chest. But despite his words, the anxiety wouldn't fade. Suddenly his phone buzzed, startling him. Emily was calling again. His heart raced as he quickly answered, pressing the phone to his ear. "Hello," he said, but all that came through was static. David almost dismissed it as an accidental call, but then faint voices broke through the interference. He strained to listen, trying to make sense of what was happening, when a voice suddenly cut through, clear and unmistakable. "Does your husband really believe you're at work?" What a fool! David froze, the words hitting him like a punch to the stomach. It took him a moment to process what he had just heard. That voice, it was Oscar. As the static cleared, the voices became more distinct. "That idiot pays for everything while you enjoy yourself in bed with me," Oscar said with a low laugh. That laugh, Oscar's laugh, sent a wave of horror through David. His pulse quickened, and his hand shook as it gripped the phone tighter. This couldn't be happening, it had to be some kind of mistake. But before he could collect his thoughts, another voice, Emily's, pierced the silence. Her voice, once soft and familiar, now carried a cruel edge. "He's too stupid to realize I've been done with this marriage for a long time. Don't even mention him, he disgusts me," she said, her words cutting into David like a knife. In that instant his world shattered. His mouth went dry, and his heart pounded in his ears, drowning out the rest of the conversation. Emily's laughter echoed, each sound more painful than the last. It wasn't just laughter, it was mockery. His hand went numb, and the phone slipped from his grasp, landing softly on the floor. He stood frozen, his mind racing, desperately searching for an explanation, an excuse, anything to make sense of what he had just heard. Oscar and Emily, his wife and his best friend, the two people he trusted most in the world. How long had they been hiding this from him? How long had his life been a lie? David collapsed onto the edge of the couch, burying his face in his hands, overwhelmed with disbelief. His eyes darted around the room, landing on the framed photos, the memories of a life he thought was his. Every smile, every cherished moment now felt tainted by betrayal. But what echoed loudest in his mind was Emily's laughter, that cruel, mocking laughter. It haunted him, as if he were the punchline in some twisted joke. Their entire life together suddenly seemed like a performance, with Oscar, the man David had considered a brother, playing the part of a co-conspirator. Every shared moment, dinners, conversations, memories now felt like poison. How many times had the three of them sat at the same table, laughing, while this deception unfolded right in front of him. How many times had Oscar looked him in the eye, all the while betraying him? David's once stable and secure world now felt as though it had been built on quicksand. The betrayal was complete, and all he could hear was the cruel echo of Emily's laughter. David clenched his fists, his fingers tightening until his knuckles turned white from the strain. A surge of rage coursed through him like a fire suddenly ignited, threatening to consume him. For a moment he wanted to break something, anything to release the anger that was overwhelming him, but as quickly as the fury flared, it subsided, giving way to an eerie, methodical calm. No, he wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. They thought they had outsmarted him, made him a fool. But they had no idea what was coming. Slowly he rose to his feet, each movement deliberate, as though guided by an invisible force. His eyes fell on the phone lying on the floor, and with a slow, calculated gesture, he picked it up and placed it back on the table without even glancing at the screen. His mind was already racing, formulating a plan. Direct confrontation? Too easy. Too predictable. They didn't deserve to see his pain. No, they would feel the weight of their betrayal in a way they could never forget. When David finished, he knew they would deeply regret ever betraying him. His chest felt heavy as a cold, unyielding hardness took root inside him. Walking down the hallway toward the bedroom, he opened the closet and gazed at Emily's belongings, dresses, shoes, remnants of a life that now felt hollow and deceitful. Without a second thought, he grabbed the suitcase from the top shelf and placed it on the bed. His hands moved with precision, folding her clothes with an eerie calmness. Each item he packed seemed to peel away another layer of his former life. Her favorite dress, the one she wore during their anniversary dinner, was tossed in without hesitation. Once the suitcase was full, he zipped it up and stepped back to survey the room, which now felt just as empty as he did. Taking a deep breath, David picked up his phone again, his voice steady, as he arranged for a courier to send the suitcase the next day. The message he included with it was short but final. Now your home is the street. Goodbye. The house was still, but for the first time, David felt an unsettling calm within. This wasn't the end, it was the start of something new. He sank into a kitchen chair, gripping the table's edge so tightly his knuckles whitened. The phone lay silent before him, its dark screen giving no hint of the chaos that had just unfolded. But David's mind replayed Oscar's smug voice and Emily's cruel laugh, stabbing him again and again like a knife. The oppressive silence of the house weighed on him, interrupted only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of the clock. Yet those sounds faded into the background as his thoughts spiraled, looping over and over. David lost track of time, slipping into a trance-like state where disbelief mixed with a simmering, controlled fury. At first his thoughts were scattered, shocked by the situation, but gradually everything began to fall into place. Every late night Emily spent away, every innocent piece of advice from Oscar, and every subtle shift in their behavior over the past few months, it all became clear. What once seemed harmless was now glaringly obvious. "They think I don't notice," he whispered to himself, his voice barely breaking the silence but sharp enough to cut through it. His jaw clenched as the paralysis of shock started to give way to a rising anger. But this wasn't wild, chaotic rage. No, David wasn't about to make a dramatic scene. That would be too easy, too predictable, and they'd likely laugh about it later. Moving with purpose, David rose from his chair, each motion deliberate, as though holding back a storm ready to break free at any moment. He wasn't going to let them walk away unscathed. He refused to play the part of the pitiful, deceived husband they likely imagined. His resolve solidified, and sleep didn't come to him that night. Instead, his mind worked tirelessly, forming a plan that evolved with each passing second. If they were willing to gamble his life for their game, he would make sure they paid dearly for it. And they wouldn't even see it coming. David spent the rest of the night at his computer, meticulously mapping out his next steps. He drafted emails, compiled a list of divorce lawyers, and noted every legal action he would need to take. His first call the next morning was to an attorney. His voice was calm, steady, without a trace of emotion slipping through. "I need the strongest restraining order you can create," David demanded, his tone cold and sure. "Understood," the attorney replied, already making notes. "Do you have proof of the affair?" they asked. David's lips twitched slightly. "I have a recording," he answered. There was a brief pause, followed by a hint of surprise. "That will help significantly. We'll file this as a breach of trust, and will ensure the divorce is swift and severe." The attorney assured him. After the call, David allowed himself a brief, bitter smile. He wasn't just ending a 30-year marriage, he was making sure Emily and Oscar felt the full weight of their treachery. The following day, David went about his work as if nothing had changed. He greeted his co-workers with his usual friendly demeanor, engaged in casual break-room conversations, and even chuckled at a joke about one of his projects. To everyone around him, he seemed like the same David. But beneath the surface, every word and smile felt hollow. His mind was consumed by the plan quietly unfolding within. During lunch, he discreetly excused himself and stepped outside to make some important calls. Without drawing attention, he arranged for a team of movers to come later that night. He had chosen a company known for its precision and speed, ensuring everything would be completed before Emily returned from her business trip. That evening, having wrapped up his affairs, David drove home with a calm yet confident demeanor. Despite his outward composure, his heart pounded in his chest. The moving truck was already parked by the curb when he arrived. David approached the head mover, unlocked the door, and gave clear instructions. Only pack the boxes from the bedroom. Be careful with everything. The team quickly got to work. David stood by, arms crossed, silently watching as they packed Emily's belongings into neat boxes, her clothes, shoes, and even the photo she insisted on hanging in the bedroom. Everything was packed without hesitation. As David walked through the house, he couldn't help but reflect on the bitter irony of it all. Once Emily had declared that this house would be their forever home. Now, the house felt like an empty shell, their life together reduced to boxes and tape. Inside, David felt no sadness, only a firm sense of resolution. Several hours passed before the movers finished. David stood in the living room, surveying the empty spaces where Emily's things had once been. He made sure nothing was left behind so that when Emily returned, it would feel as though she had been erased from the home. "That's everything," so the lead mover said, handing David the final bill. David nodded, quickly wrote a check, and handed it over. "Take everything to this address," he said, giving the mover a slip of paper with Oscar's address. The mover raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "Understood," he replied. David watched as the truck pulled away, carrying Emily's belongings into the night. As it disappeared from view, his racing heart slowed, replaced by a serene sense of finality. This was only the beginning. David went back inside, sat at the kitchen table, and opened his laptop. He pulled up the photos he had taken earlier, capturing the empty house, the bare bedroom, and the spotless living room. He printed them and carefully laid them beside the divorce papers on the table. The final touch was the note he had written earlier, "You deserve nothing." "Goodbye," he placed it on top of the stack and paused, staring at it. It wasn't poetic, but it didn't need to be. It was done. The truth had finally come to light. That night, as the house was shrouded in a heavy silence, David packed his own suitcase. He had no intention of being there when Emily returned. He wasn't going to give her the chance to cry, beg, or invent excuses for her betrayal. Everything had spiraled out of control, and before walking away for good, David did one last thing. He blocked both Emily's and Oscar's numbers. Neither of them would be able to contact him, and they'd have no chance to ask for his forgiveness. They had taken everything from him, and now it was his turn to take something from them. As he closed the door behind him, an unexpected sense of lightness swept over him. The man he once was, the one who trusted easily and believed in love and loyalty, was gone. In his place was someone colder, sharper, and far more dangerous. He got into the car, started the engine, and drove off without looking back. By the time Emily and Oscar figured out what had happened, he would be nothing but a distant memory. They thought they had won, but this was only the beginning. Emily pulled into the driveway, exhausted from her business trip. She was ready to settle back into her routine, smile at David, and continue their charade. The lies were a burden, but they had become almost second nature, nearly effortless. As she stepped out of the car, keys in hand, something felt off. The house was completely dark, which was strange because David always left the lights on for her. Dismissing the odd feeling, she walked to the front door, her heels tapping softly on the pavement. She opened the door, expecting the familiar warmth of home, but instead she was greeted by an unsettling silence. The house didn't feel the same. The usual comfort was absent, and there was a strange chill in the air. "David," she called out, dropping her bag by the door. Silence. Confused, Emily walked through the living room, glancing around. Everything looked the same: the couch, the TV, the dining table, but something was off. Small, familiar details were missing. Her shoes weren't by the door, her coat wasn't on the hook, and the perfume bottles on the shelf were gone. Everything had vanished, even the wedding and vacation photos were missing. A wave of panic swept over her as she hurried to the bedroom. Her heart pounded as she flung open the closet doors. Her side was empty, no dresses, no shoes, nothing was left. Fear gripped her as she rushed back to the living room, frantically digging through her purse for her phone. Emily tried calling David, but instead of an answer, she was met with his voicemail. She called again, with the same result. "What the hell is going on?" she muttered, staring at her phone as if it held the answers. Her anxiety escalated as she typed a message, her fingers trembling. "David, where are you? Call me back immediately." This isn't funny. Seconds dragged into minutes, each one feeling like an eternity as she waited for a response. Her mind raced, and she nervously paced around the living room, sensing that something was very wrong. Where was he? But true terror struck her when she realized all her belongings were gone. Panic surged as she ran to the kitchen. There, on the table, lay a stack of documents. Her heart stopped. Divorce papers. On top of them was a photograph with a note attached. Her stomach turned as she recognized the picture. It was from last year's barbecue, showing her Oscar and David all smiling. The memory washed over her. They had seemed so happy then, so untouchable, but now the photo mocked her, a cruel reminder of the lies that had shattered their world. Next to the photo was a note. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, fear constricting her chest. The message was sharp and venomous. "Your new home is the street. Goodbye." Emily's eyes lingered on the words, their sting cutting deep into her soul. It was as if the words were screaming at her, delivering a sentence from which there was no escape. She had been so sure, she'd been careful, confident that David would never find out. But she had been wrong, so very, very wrong. The phone slipped from her hand, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Her heart raced, and her breathing became rapid and shallow. David knew there was no turning back now. But how had he discovered her secret? In a daze, she fumbled to dial Oscar's number, her fingers barely cooperating. He answered on the third ring, his voice calm, unaware of the chaos that was about to unfold. "Hey, what's going on?" he asked. Emily's voice trembled, barely masking her panic. "What the hell is happening?" she demanded, her words spilling out in a rush, tinged with fear. Oscar paused, confusion clear in his tone. "What are you talking about?" he asked, uncertainty in his voice. "David," she blurted out, her voice sharp with frustration. "He's gone, Oscar. All my things are missing, and there are divorce papers on the table. How could he have found out?" Oscar didn't respond right away. The silence stretched between them, the tension thickening. Emily could feel the weight of his hesitation pressing down on her. Then a faint sound came from his end of the line, followed by an eerie stillness. "Oscar," Emily's voice wavered, her throat tight with anxiety. "What's going on?" There was a pause. I just need to check something," Oscar stammered, the creak of a door audible in the background. Emily began pacing nervously, biting her lip as frustration gnawed at her. Her nerves were frayed, her hands shaking so badly she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. When Oscar spoke again, his voice was quieter, more cautious. "Oh no, what? What happened?" Emily's heart raced. "It looks like David sent your stuff here," Oscar said, his voice tense. "There's a truck outside, and they're unloading boxes with your name on them." Emily's world crumbled beneath her. She struggled to breathe. "Tell me this is some kind of sick joke," she whispered, desperate for a different answer. "It's not a joke," Oscar replied quietly, resignation in his voice. "There's a photo taped to one of the boxes from that barbecue." Emily didn't need to ask which photo it was. It was the same one that had been on her kitchen table. "He knows everything," she whispered, her voice hollow, barely audible. "He knows it all." Oscar's response was soft, barely a whisper. "Yes, he knows." Without hesitation, Emily ended the call and bolted out of the house. The drive to Oscar's house passed by in a blur, her thoughts swirling in chaos. When she arrived, the sight of the truck still parked outside made her stomach churn. Boxes were stacked on Oscar's lawn, her name clearly written on each one. Emily stepped out of the car, her legs weak and unsteady as she approached the pile. Oscar stood on the porch, arms folded, his expression unreadable. They exchanged no words, there was no need. Emily turned toward him and whispered, barely audible, "What do we do now?" Oscar ran a hand through his hair, letting out a heavy, frustrated sigh. I don't know, Emily. He's gone. He's not answering my calls either. Emily bit her lip as tears filled her eyes, unable to hold them back. He can't just vanish, she whispered. Oscar shook his head, resignation written all over his face. Emily, he's furious. You saw what he wrote in the note. He's not coming back. For the first time, the full gravity of her actions hit her. She had destroyed everything: her marriage, her life with David, for what? A fleeting affair that had long since lost its spark. Her legs buckled, and she collapsed onto the porch steps, burying her face in her hands. What do we do now? She asked, her voice trembling and barely audible. Oscar remained silent beside her, watching as she fell apart. He had no comforting words, no solutions to offer. What had once been an exciting, forbidden romance had unraveled into complete chaos. There was nothing left to salvage. They sat there in oppressive silence, feeling the weight of their predicament. David was gone, and with his departure their entire world had crumbled. Emily's gaze drifted to the scattered boxes across the lawn, her hands clutching the divorce papers. In one reckless moment she had lost everything, and there was no way to go back. She retreated to the bedroom, sliding down against the wall, gripping her phone in her trembling hands. Her mind raced with thoughts, the silence around her amplifying her guilt and regret. David's words from the note echoed endlessly in her mind, like a fresh wound. This couldn't be the end. She couldn't let everything end like this. There had to be a way to make him understand, to fix it somehow. David wasn't the type of man to leave without a fight. He had always loved her, despite all the ups and downs. It couldn't be possible that everything they had built had collapsed this way. With shaking hands, Emily scrolled through her phone contacts and dialed David's number again. Her heart pounded with each ring: 1, 2, 3, but no answer. She cursed under her breath, tears threatening to spill as panic surged. She hit redial, pleading silently for him to pick up. After what felt like an eternity, the ringing stopped, and his voice came through cold and distant. "What do you want?" Emily, the sound of his voice washed over her, leaving her breathless for a moment. Emily had rehearsed this conversation in her mind countless times, imagining every possible scenario. But now, with David on the line, her mind went blank. She struggled to find the right words, her tears threatening to spill as she forced herself to speak. "David, please, give me a chance to explain," she murmured, her voice shaky. "I know I hurt you deeply. I know what I did is unforgivable, but—" David cut her off, his voice sharp with anger. "A mistake. Do you really think that's all this was?" Emily, he didn't wait for a response. "It wasn't just a mistake. You destroyed everything we had. You lied to me, betrayed me, and slept with Oscar. And now you expect me to sit here and listen to you." "Please, David," she pleaded, her voice barely holding together. "I'm so sorry. I regret it more than you could ever imagine. It was a moment of weakness." David's laughter was harsh and hollow. "A moment of weakness? Don't insult me, Emily. People don't cheat by accident." His words hit her like a physical blow, the weight of his anger and disappointment crushing her. She had known this would be difficult, but the reality was unbearable. "I understand you're furious," she whispered, wiping away the tears now streaming down her face. "I know you probably hate me right now, but can't we at least talk about this? We can fix it, David. I'll do whatever it takes to mend what I've broken." There was silence on the other end, and for a brief moment Emily allowed herself a sliver of hope. Maybe he was thinking about her words, considering them. Maybe they could have a real conversation, like they used to. But when David finally spoke, his voice was colder than before. "There's nothing to fix, Emily," he said, his tone devoid of warmth. "I'm done." Her heart clenched painfully, her breath catching in her throat. "Please, David, don't say that. Don't let it end like this." "You should have thought about that before you went behind my back," David continued, his voice unrelenting. "You and Oscar are perfect for each other. Don't ever contact me again." "No, David," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "I'll do anything, please. Just talk to me, don't do this." The silence that followed was suffocating. Emily barely breathed, desperately hoping for some sign that he might reconsider. But when David spoke again, his words were like a final blow. "Goodbye, Emily." The line went dead. Emily stared at the phone, the realization hitting her like a tidal wave. It was truly completely over. The persistent sound of the dial tone echoed in her ears as her trembling fingers lost their grip, and the phone fell to the floor with a soft thud. The full weight of what had just happened washed over her, and she collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably. David was gone. Everything she had once known had disappeared. She couldn't catch her breath, her chest tightening with each sob. How had it come to this? How had she allowed everything to spiral so far out of control? She had never believed David would find out the truth, and even if he did, she had convinced herself that he would somehow forgive her again, as he had done with her smaller betrayals, forgotten anniversaries, broken promises, harsh words spoken in anger. But this time was different. There would be no forgiveness. Curled up on the floor, her tears soaked the carpet, and her mind replayed every moment of her deceit. The lies, the secrets, the brief thrill she'd shared with Oscar, now it all seemed like the worst decision of her life. How had she sunk so low? The phone rang again, but it wasn't David, it was Oscar. Wiping her tear-streaked face, she hesitated before answering. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice hollow and lifeless. "Emily, I talked to him," Oscar said, his voice tense. "He's serious. He's not coming back. He filed for divorce." She muttered, barely audible, "He filed for divorce." Oscar sighed on the other end of the line. "What do we do now?" "I don't know," Emily admitted, her voice broken. "He's gone, Oscar. He hates me." There was a pause before Oscar spoke again, his voice hesitant. "Maybe we can still explain things to him. Tell him what really happened." It wasn't meant to end this way. Fresh tears blurred Emily's eyes as she squeezed them shut. "He doesn't care anymore. He doesn't want to hear us out." In his mind, it's already over. The weight of her own words crushed her. David had always been her anchor, the one constant in her life, and now he was gone. Oscar's voice softened, filled with regret. "I'm so sorry, Emily. This was never part of the plan. It doesn't matter anymore," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. It's too late. Without waiting for more hollow apologies, she ended the call. What good were apologies when everything was already destroyed? The life she had built with David, the trust that had once defined their relationship, was broken beyond repair. With great effort, she forced herself to rise from the floor, her legs trembling. The house felt emptier than ever, as though every trace of the life it once held had vanished. Emily wandered through the now empty rooms, her fingers barely brushing the surfaces where her things had once been. Everything felt foreign and distant, as though this place no longer belonged to her. Eventually she found herself in the kitchen, her eyes settling on the divorce papers lying on the table. At the bottom was David's signature, his handwriting neat, final. Emily's fingers traced the letters of his name, feeling the weight of reality sink heavily into her chest. That was it. It was happening. She had lost him, and nothing could change that now. Her phone vibrated again, but this time she didn't even bother checking it. Whoever it was didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered. The person she loved was gone, and all that remained was the regret for things that could never be undone. Meanwhile, Oscar sat alone in his dark living room, the coldness of the house almost suffocating. He stared at the empty wine glass in his hand, the laughter of his children, once a comforting backdrop to his evenings, now a distant memory. They had left days ago, and the silence in the house was overwhelming. He hadn't seen it coming, though in hindsight perhaps he should have. The end had come swiftly, an unsigned letter, handed to Margaret one evening as she picked up their daughter from school. The message was brief. Hastily scrawled, "Your husband is with Emily. Ask David if you need proof." Margaret hadn't waited to come home. She called David right then and there, and he confirmed everything. The confrontation that followed was something Oscar had never imagined he'd face, but now it was seared into his memory. Margaret stormed into the house, her face red with fury. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" she demanded from the doorway, the crumpled note clenched in her fist. Oscar froze, still sitting at the dining table with his laptop open in front of him. He looked up, initially confused, but when their eyes met, a wave of dread twisted in his gut. "Find out what?" he asked, though the quiver in his voice betrayed the fact that he already knew. Margaret threw the note onto the table. "You were with Emily," she accused. Oscar's gaze fell on the note, his mouth dry. He wanted to deny it, to argue, but the words wouldn't come. His silence was louder than any defense he could have made. "How could you do this? To me, to our family, to our children?" Margaret's voice wavered, her anger cracking under the weight of her pain. Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes as she clutched the back of the chair, her knuckles white. Oscar, standing across from her, reached out, his eyes pleading. "Margaret, I didn't mean," he started, but she cut him off with a sharp gesture, stepping back. "Don't even think about touching me," she warned, her voice sharp. His apology came out in a broken whisper. "I'm sorry. I didn't want it to end like this." Margaret's voice shook with disbelief, quickly giving way to raw anger. "What? You just accidentally ended up in bed with her? Is that your excuse?" Oscar stood there, speechless, knowing there was nothing he could say to undo what had been done. With one reckless choice, he had destroyed his wife's trust, his children's faith in him, and his friendship with David, all for an affair that had lost its thrill the moment it was exposed. "I can't do this anymore." Margaret's voice cracked, her strength unraveling before his eyes. "I'm leaving." With trembling hands, she grabbed her coat and keys, her movements frantic and unsure. Oscar stood frozen and helpless as she headed for the door. "Margaret, please wait," he pleaded, his voice desperate as he rushed after her, his heart pounding in his chest. "We can talk. Don't leave." She paused at the door, still facing away from him, her posture stiff. "There's nothing left to talk about, Oscar," she said coldly, her tone final. "I'm leaving, and I'm taking the kids. Don't even think about trying to stop me." Her voice was icy and detached, making the air between them frigid. "You've already lost us." With a soft click, the door shut behind her, and Oscar felt his life slip away with her departure. In the days that followed, Emily moved in with Oscar. She had her own troubles. After the affair came to light, every attempt she made to contact David had gone unanswered. The only thing left of him were the divorce papers, now gathering dust on the kitchen table. The house had been sold, and David had disappeared without a trace, leaving no clue as to where he'd gone. Now, Oscar and Emily, once lovers entangled in a secret affair, sat in the ruins of the lives they had shattered. What had once felt like an exhilarating secret, stolen moments of forbidden passion now suffocated them under the weight of reality. One evening, sitting in the dimly lit kitchen, Emily stared blankly at her wine glass, her voice distant. "I thought we did it for each other," she whispered, her tone hollow. Oscar sighed deeply, pressing his hands to his forehead, as if trying to wipe away the past. "I'm not even sure anymore, Emily. Look at what we've done." Though neither of them spoke the words aloud, they both knew the truth. Their affair, built on lies and betrayal, had destroyed everything they had once held dear. The thrill had vanished, leaving behind only the harsh truth of shattered lives. Margaret had taken the children and left, while Emily's marriage had dissolved into a stack of unsigned divorce papers. Oscar's career had crumbled, the rumors about his scandal spreading like wildfire, and his once pristine reputation, especially among his married clients, lay in ruins. Almost overnight, his professional opportunities disappeared. "I can't do this anymore," he muttered one evening, staring blankly at the empty wall in front of him. "It's all over." Emily didn't reply, but the same sorrow reflected in her eyes. Her life, once filled with dreams and ambitions, had turned into a bleak reality. She found herself living in a half-empty house with a man she no longer had feelings for. What had once seemed exciting and forbidden now felt stifling, like a cage. The weight of shame pressed down on her, intensified by David's absence. The day after she moved her belongings into Oscar's house, David disappeared. He packed his things and left without a word, no address, no goodbye, no trace of him on social media. It was as if he had erased himself from their lives. The house sold within weeks, and the money quietly transferred to a new account in his name. Oscar tried reaching out to him only once, but his call went straight to voicemail. Leaving a message felt pointless. David had severed all connections. But his sudden departure wasn't an escape, it was a deliberate step toward a fresh start. David relocated to a new city, where no one knew about his past or the betrayal he had endured. He threw himself into his work, focusing on rebuilding his career, improving his health, and ultimately finding happiness. While Oscar and Emily floundered, David thrived. He embraced every opportunity, earning the respect of those around him. His social circle expanded, filled with people who valued him for who he had become, not for the mistakes of the past. Time passed. Weeks turned into months, months into years. Slowly, the scars of the past began to fade. David met new people, forged meaningful relationships, and found a new love, one built on trust and understanding. It was something he hadn't even realized was missing in his relationship with Emily until everything fell apart. Meanwhile, Oscar's isolation deepened. His marriage to Margaret had officially ended, and she moved far away, taking the children with her. His career never recovered, and his relationship with Emily became strained, a constant reminder of the destruction they had caused. Eventually she left too, and their lives took separate paths. Both Oscar and Emily tried to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, struggling to escape the consequences of their choices. But while they remained trapped in their bleak reality, David had already moved on. He had rebuilt his life from the ground up, stronger and happier than ever. The man they had once thought naive and gullible was now thriving in ways they couldn't have imagined. Oscar sat alone in his empty house, the void around him a stark contrast to the once vibrant life he had known. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything had slipped through his fingers, his family, his confidant, his successful career, all lost to a fleeting affair that had cost him everything. Emily was gone, and David had emerged victorious. While David had survived the chaos and grown stronger, Oscar remained stuck, buried in the ruins of his own life. Years had passed since the truth came out, since the betrayal shattered lives and severed the fragile connections holding everything together. Both Emily and Oscar carried the scars of what had happened, never fully recovering from the damage. They tried to move forward, but the consequences of their actions loomed over them like a dark cloud from which there was no escape. Emily sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone, her fingers hovering over David's name in her contact list. His number was still saved, despite the years of silence between them. She had lost track of how many times she had tried to reach out, sending messages, leaving voicemails filled with apologies, regret, and desperate pleas for forgiveness. None of them ever received a response. Oscar had disappeared from her life, and their brief attempt at a relationship after the affair had crumbled into bitterness. The man who once seemed like her escape had become her prison, intensifying the suffocating feeling she already had. After they parted ways, Emily was left alone to deal with the aftermath of her choices. Taking a deep breath, she typed yet another message to David. "I'm sorry. I just want you to know that I'm sorry for everything." Her finger hovered over the send button, fully aware it would change nothing. David never responded. The familiar sound of the message being delivered echoed in the quiet room as she tossed the phone aside, sinking into the bed and staring up at the ceiling. Time had passed, but her life remained frozen in the wreckage of what once was. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw an aging face and eyes dulled by the weight of regret. The pleasure she had once chased was long gone, leaving behind only emptiness. Her career, once full of promise, had stagnated. She still went to work, but the passion that had once driven her had evaporated. Friends who once surrounded her had drifted away, taking sides when her affair became public. Now she was left alone, steeped in her own misery, with no one to blame but herself. One evening, Emily found herself walking through the city park, the same one where she and David had spent so many weekends together before everything fell apart. The familiar paths stirred memories of laughter and moments stolen on benches, their hands intertwined. A bittersweet longing filled her heart, reminding her of the life she had so carelessly thrown away. As she rounded the corner toward the lake, her steps slowed, and she stopped. Ahead of her, David stood alone, his hands buried deep in his pockets, his attention fixed on the ducks gliding across the pond. There was a calmness about him now, a quiet assurance, something Emily hadn't seen in him for a long time. The sight of him stirred a sudden rush of emotions within her, a sharp reminder of what she once had and lost. Her heart raced, and for a moment she considered stepping back, disappearing before he noticed her. But something inside her, something stronger than her fear, refused to let her walk away. She needed this moment, no matter how brief, for closure. She needed to hear his voice one last time. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. "David," she called softly. He slowly turned his head, his expression unreadable, as their eyes met. There was no anger, no resentment, just a distant familiarity, as if she were someone from a past life, disconnected from his present. "Emily," he said, his tone even but empty of emotion. Her breath caught. Hearing his voice after so many years stirred emotions she thought she had buried long ago. She wanted to explain, to beg for his forgiveness, to prove she was no longer the woman who had shattered their world. "I tried to reach you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I wanted to say how sorry I am. I was wrong, so terribly wrong." David's gaze remained steady, his face calm, as if her words held little significance. He nodded slightly, acknowledging her but offering nothing more. "I know I hurt you," she continued, her voice quivering under the weight of her regret. "I know I destroyed everything we had, and I'll carry that guilt forever. I need to know if there's any chance, any small chance, that you could ever forgive me." The silence that followed was almost suffocating. The distance between them seemed to expand, filled with words left unsaid. She searched his face for any sign that her plea had reached him, but David remained indifferent, distant. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke, his voice quiet yet firm. "There's nothing left to forgive." His words, cold and final, chilled the air around her, sending a shiver through Emily. This wasn't the forgiveness she had longed for, nor the closure she had desperately sought all these years. It was the finality of his statement that hurt the most. He had moved on, leaving her firmly in the past with no way to return to what once was. Emily opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The emotional weight pressed down on her, and tears welled up in her eyes. It wasn't just the betrayal, the lies, or the broken promises that tormented her. What pained her most was the bitter reality that she had lost the one person who had truly cared for her. Now, standing in front of him, she realized there would never be anyone like him again. David gave her a polite smile, the kind one gives a stranger passing by on the street. Without another word, he turned and walked away. Emily stood there, watching as he slowly disappeared into the distance, the sound of his footsteps fading until all she could hear was the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant hum of the park. Emily remained standing for a long time, feeling hollow, her thoughts scattered. There was no chance for redemption, no way to rebuild what had been destroyed. She had ruined everything. Meanwhile, as David walked away, he felt an unexpected calm. The encounter with Emily had surprised him, but it hadn't stirred any emotions, no anger, no sadness, only peace. His life had moved forward, and he was embracing this new chapter, far from the wreckage of his past. He was surrounded by new friends who valued him for who he was, and he had found love again, this time based on mutual respect and kindness, something Emily had never truly offered him. His career was thriving, and each day brought meaning and fulfillment. The betrayal that once consumed him had become a distant memory, a closed chapter from a former life. As the sun began to set, casting the park in a golden light, David smiled to himself. He had weathered the storm and emerged stronger, more resilient. His happiness was his triumph, and nothing from the past could take that away. Emily had made her choices, and now he was fully immersed in his own life, free from the shadows that once haunted him. He had found peace, and in the end, that was all that truly mattered.